Hi guys, so we're going to talk about the command line, the terminal, and those commands that we use in the terminal and how that all works. To do that, we have to talk about files and directories first, and then we can talk about commands, and then it'll all start to make sense. Okay, so let's talk about basics. What do computers store? They store files. Okay, they do, but the files need to be arranged somehow, right? So that's called directories. So some people call directories folders, and that means the same thing. So if someone says directory or folder, they're talking about the same thing. They're talking about a directory that can hold files. Now, when you use Finder on Mac or Explorer in Windows, you're seeing a visual idea of directories and files. So what do we have? We have files that go in a directory. That's easy enough. Now, where do directories go? Okay, so if you think about it, if I have an empty drive, like an empty USB stick or just a brand new computer with an empty drive, is there a directory? And the answer is yes. You always have a root directory, right? Like the basic, simplest directory, which is a place to put everything else. So you have a root directory, and in that you can put your named directories, and in those named directories you can organize your things. So now we have an idea that there is a root directory. We can name our own directories, and we can organize our files in our directories, and the files are where we store our content, whether it's videos or text or the things we work on. Okay, so we almost know enough to start talking about commands, but there's a little bit more we have to understand first. So, operating systems. We understand that an operating system is a set of programs that manages the computer hardware, and it makes the computer work. All modern computers and phones have an operating system, and in iOS and Mac OS, for instance, the OS stands for operating system. So Linux, Mac OS, iOS, they're all based on a concept of operating system called Unix. Windows it evolved differently, but it has evolved similar ideas. So what we're going to talk about works for all of them. Okay, so why is this important? When you get a brand new computer, is it blank? And the answer is no, it can't be. Because on a brand new computer, you have an operating system. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. And the operating system is made up of files, just like everything else on a computer. So, of course, the operating system's files are organized in directories, and all of those files and directories are stored in the root directory of the hard drive that's built in to the computer. So, that's great. We have a brand new computer, let's say, and that's got an operating system and directories. Now, when you log in for the first time, remember computers these days support multiple users. So if you're using a Mac, you can log in, you can create an account, and you can log in, you can create an account for your friend or for your family members, and everybody can use that computer. So computers deal with multiple users. Right, now how does that work? So if you think about it, when I log in, I see my files. I don't see other users' files. That's a good thing, of course. Now, that means that somehow my personal files are being stored differently than other user files. So how do you think that might work? Obviously, there has to be a directory involved. So there is actually a directory for every user. It's called the home directory, which means that every user has one. And that home directory is kind of like a root directory for the user. So when I make a new account for myself on a brand new computer and I log in, it's created a home directory for me. It'll have my name or my username. And when I create files, they're going to be stored in that home directory. Now, the other thing that's useful to think about is, you know how you use a computer, you have a desktop, okay, and you've got your icons on the desktop that you click with your mouse. Now, have you noticed that the desktop is different for each user? Yep. The desktop is stored in the home directory somewhere, and in fact the desktop is another directory. So when you look in a computer, whether it's Windows or Mac, they both do the same thing, you'll find you have a home directory, then you have a desktop directory, and the desktop directory stores files that represent the icons and where those icons are on the directory, and any other properties that personalize that desktop. So as you can see, everything about a computer works through files and directories. And as a user, you have your own home directory. So now we have the idea, we have a root directory for the overall hard drive. We have operating system directories and files that we shouldn't play with. We don't want to delete those. You'll make the computer not work anymore if you do that, which means we need to do our work separately to the operating system. So we each have home directories, and then in those home directories we can customize, how our computer works for us when we log in. We can also store our personal files in that home directory. Okay, so we are going to talk about a command line interface or interpreter called Bash. Why are we going to talk about Bash? Bash is included with Mac, as in Mac OS. It's included with Linux. You can even install it in Windows, but it is a separate installation with Windows. Bash is an interpreter, just like with JavaScript. JavaScript is an interpreter. So the interpreter is just something that can understand commands and perform those actions. Now Bash is an interpreter that deals with files and directories. And Bash works like having a conversation with the computer about files and directories. So that's actually been around for a very long time, and it's quite a good thing. And you might ask, well, why is that a good thing? So it's a good thing that Bash works like a conversation about files and directories. Imagine, for instance, you had to deal with a computer that's in the cloud. You're dealing with a remote machine over the internet. You don't really want to be using mouse clicks and very visual interfaces with a machine that you're accessing over the internet, because all of those mouse clicks and all of those pixels that make up that screen have to be transmitted over the internet, and that takes a lot of download and a lot of upload to make that a very responsive sort of interaction. It also means that that's going to be pretty slow. There's a long round trip delay with all that stuff. And it also means if you're having to click and look on a screen and find a visual representation of some icon to then double click and do something, every desktop, every computer, remote computer you're dealing with will look different. So it's very hard to have repeatable and reliable instructions that you give a remote computer. So using a text-based interface that talks about files and directories, which are what the computer deals with as its main thing, that's its basic currency. So it makes a lot more sense to actually use a command line interface for this particular purpose. And that's why when it comes to developing software or writing scripts like JavaScript to make computers do things in a reliable, repeatable way, we prefer to use command lines. So what we have on the screen here is like I said, it's Bash. You can see it's a Bash prompt. So we have a flashing cursor where I can type, and I can just type. That's just rubbish I'm typing now. So it's an interpreter. It's going to try and interpret whatever I type, but it won't do that until I hit enter. So I've typed in a bunch of rubbish. If I hit enter, it's going to say command not found. So the way it works is it tries to find a program that represents that command, or it has an internal command that the interpreter understands to try and process what you've just told it to do. So that didn't make any sense at all. A very simple command that does make sense is echo. So I can say echo hi, and it will repeat hi. I can do echo hi there, and of course it with quotes around that, just because it's got a space, and sure enough it will repeat hi there. That's not very meaningful, and that's not about files or directories either. Okay, now because you're having a conversation about directories and files, there needs to be some idea of what's the current conversation about. Just like if you're talking with your friends know what the conversation's about. If you start talking about cars, they're not going to, well, most of the time they're not going to start talking about cats. You know, you're having a conversation about cars. So with a computer, with Bash in particular, you can have a conversation about a directory. So it has an idea of a current directory, which is the directory you're having a conversation about. So we can find out what that directory is if we forgot. As you know, one of the participants in this conversation, we might change directories and do things. So we're changing what the conversation's about, and we lost track because we're only human. We get tired. We can ask the computer, what's the present working directory we're talking about with pwd. Now, it's answered /home/wasam or wasam. Wasam is my username. /home obviously is the directory where all the home directories go. So wasam is my home directory in the home directory. So what is this telling us? That tells me that the current directory is my home directory. Now this makes sense. With Bash, when you first start using Bash, so you start terminal on the Mac, it'll start running Bash, it's going to put you in the home directory, right? Your personal home directory. Now, I can change directories, and I can make new directories, and I can make files. So how do I make a directory? Make dir. So you'll find that a lot of Bash commands are shortened, and it's the fewest characters to remind you of what that command might mean. So mkdir means make directory. So I can do make directory test underscore or test dash. I'll use test dash dir, and if I do ls, I can see that test dash dir is there. It's this one. Now notice it's got a green highlight. Now not every Bash you'll experience has highlights like this, but the green highlight there means those things are directories. Now I can change directory into test dir, and that means that I'm telling Bash, let's change the conversation to be about what's in test dir. Now notice here I hit one key and it finished the rest of the name for me. So there are some keystrokes that you can learn that make it easier to deal with Bash. I can do Control U to get rid of everything on the command that I've typed. So if I type garbage, if I lean on the keyboard or start tapping randomly, if a cat jumps on the keyboard and starts walking around on the keyboard, and I want to get rid of all that mess, I can do Control U and it's gone. Not to be confused with Command on a Mac, I mean Control. Even on a Mac, Control U. Now, so again, I can hit CD and start hitting test, and I can use tab to complete. So that will just complete, if what I've typed is unique, then it will complete it. Okay, now I hit CD and we can see that the prompt has changed. Notice it has a tilde. So this character here is tilde, and that represents that's a short name for the home directory. So if I say, so CD of course means change directory, so if I do CD tilde, I'll be back in my home directory. And if I do ls for list, you can see test dir again is in the current directory that I'm in, because I've gone back to the home directory. Test directory is now something inside the directory I'm talking about. So again, I can do CD test directory like this, and we've gone back into test directory. So that's now the conversation is about test directory. If I do ls, It's empty. There's nothing in it because we only just made it a little while ago. It's a blank directory. So yes, I could make another directory inside this. Call it inner. If I type ls, we can now see that inner is there and inner is highlighted, so we know it's a directory. If I want to know for sure, let's say that I'm dealing with someone's bash setup and it doesn't have the highlight like I've got here, I can do ls minus l. Minus means options, and so if I use the L option, it means long. It will give me a longer listing of what's in the directory. And we can see with this longer listing that I get a D here. The D means that's a directory. Now I can make a file. In Bash there's an editor called, there's a few editors. There's one called VI. Now I'm not going to talk too much about how to make VI work. It has its own series of keystrokes you have to learn in order to make VI work. But I can very quickly make a little file just to show you what files look like. So this will be test file. Now I'm editing my test file and I can do hello there, this is a test file. And then I can write that. Now, so I've written that file now. If I do ls, we can see inner and test file, and notice the difference in the highlight. But if I want to know for sure what these things are, then, okay, I need to scroll. Then we can see that we've got inner and test file separately, and we can see that the directory inner has a D, so it's a directory, and we can see that the file has a dash instead of a D, so it's just a file. We can also see there's some other letters here that these are attributes of the file. So here, for instance, read and write is what the RW stands for, and for a directory, X means that you can go into the directory, you can use it. We're not going to worry about how you change these attributes. These are for sort of security or permissions. So I can change these permissions so that certain people can access them, or everybody can access this directory or the files. Let's not worry about that right now. By default, if you create a directory and you create files because you own them, which is what this is telling me, I'm the owner. So because I own it, I have read and write access to the directories and files that I create, especially in my home directory. So we don't have to worry about changing any access permissions. I create it, I've got access, it's all good. Okay, so now we have a test directory called tester, we have an inner directory which we've left blank at the moment, we have a test file, so that's great. So we have files, we have directories. So what else can we do? We can remove a file. So rm means remove, and if I say rm test file and then do ls, sure enough it's gone. So rm means remove. You obviously want to use that with some care, and I can try to remove inner. That doesn't work. So one thing they've done with Bash is to make it very clear. If you're trying to remove a file, you use rm. If you're trying to remove a directory, you have to use rmdir. Rmdir inner, and that works. Okay, so we can see here that in this conversation that we have with Bash, it will tell me if I'm doing something silly or something it doesn't understand. It will also separate files and directories so that we can manage those. We can make them, and we can change what the conversation is about with cd being change directory and pwd to find out what the conversation is about. Now I talked before that we have a root directory. So the root directory has no name, which means that if I do cd slash, now slash is a character that separates directories. Now root has no name, so there's no name before the slash. So if I do that, I'm now in the root directory, and I can do ls, and I can see directories and a couple of files here. Um, so the highlight's a bit different here, but for instance, bin is a directory that's owned by the operating system. So it's made by the operating system and owned by the operating system, so the highlight's a bit different. Now obviously I don't want to go deleting these directories that are in the root directory because they're set up by the operating system, but most of them are owned by the operating system, so I don't want to mess about with those. I can cd into home, and let's do an ls in there, and we can see that there's a couple of users on this machine. So we have Wazam, which is my user, and there's a thing GitLab runner, which is for something else. That's a different user. And obviously I can cd into Wazam, and I'm now in my home directory again, so the prompt is showing me it's showing me this tilde, because I've basically arrived back in my home directory. And remember, the prompt, the tilde means the home directory. It's a short name, an alias. Okay, so I'm in my home directory, and obviously I can do an ls and see everything in my directory, and tester is still there. So that all makes sense. Okay, so what we've learned just now is that we have directories and files that when we can do an ls to list what's in the current directory, and it will show us what they are. We can do a long listing with -l, and we can see the attributes of those things. You can also see the dates they were created, which is all great and useful. We can make new directories, we can remove directories, we can create files, we can remove files, and there are commands for all that. If you want to know more about bash or one of the commands, you can use the man command, which is short for manual. So I can do man bash, and it will show me a lot of information about bash, and I can use space to page through that manual, and when I get bored and want to quit, I can hit Q to quit. And so you have manual, and if you want to find out more about the manual, you can do man on man, which is the manual for the manual, and it tells you that it's an interactive online manual. Again, Q to quit. Okay, so we've learnt about echo, the fact that I can echo something. We've learnt about man, we've learnt about, or manual, we've learnt about ls, we've learnt about changing directory, pwd to get the present working directory or the current directory, and we've learnt about removing files, and we've learnt about removing directories. When we want to execute a command, basically typing in the name of that command is enough to execute it. So that means we're going to run that command. So for instance, when we type in node, that means we're running node.js, which we have done before. So now I'm running the node interpreter, right? This is a JavaScript interpreter, and now I've got a different prompt from the JavaScript interpreter, nodes interpreter, which is that greater than character we can see. Okay, and here I can do console.log from JavaScript. Okay, and that's a JavaScript, and it says undefined as a response because that command has no value returning. So now we're having a JavaScript conversation, and I can exit out of the JavaScript interpreter, and I'm back in Bash, and you can see that we have the username at the machine name. So that's what that, and some hint of what the directory is, the current directory. So we can see that we're back in Bash. So we're having the Bash conversation again about files and directories. Bash has a concept of variables. They're called environment variables. And they're called environment variables because when you run a program in Bash, those programs can actually get the values of those variables, and so those variables make up the environment that program is running in. So for instance, I'm a user, and as a logged in user onto a Linux system, there is a variable that represents the user's name, and that variable is called user, and I can get I can see what the value of that is by doing echo. I put the dollar, meaning I want to talk about a variable, user, and it tells me that the current logged in user, that this bash session was am, which we kind of knew because of the because of this part here in the prompt. I can also do things like echo $shell. Shell is the program running as the interpreter, and it tells me it's /bin/bash. /bin being one of the directories where operating system puts its where a Linux or Unix-like operating system puts its programs. Bash being one of those programs. That's why that's in /bin/bash. There are many other environment variables, and we can, even for the present working directory, there is an environment variable which very much matches the command pwd echo $ in caps pwd, and you'll see the exact same thing that the pwd command would give you, and that changes. So if we go into tester echo pwd, it's being maintained by bash. Okay, so we've learned a couple of important things. We've learned how to create a directory, we've learned how to remove a directory, we've learned how to manipulate, find files in that directory, we've learned about environment variables, and we've learned how to start programs like Node, and that Node is one interpreter and Bash is a different interpreter, and how to see the difference between which interpreter is running because of the prompt. Okay.